everyone. I'm Dr. Erin Amato with Montana Psychiatry and Brain Health Center, and thank you for tuning in today to this Facebook Live. I'm hoping I can share some helpful information with you. And the topic that I had come up with today is this idea of righting the curve in terms of managing grief and anxiety and change that have come up for a lot of people during this time of COVID. And the reason that I'm talking about this idea of righting the curve is we've certainly heard of the term flatten the curve over the last few weeks. And I'm sure you've all been tuning into the news where they've shown the different projections and graphs and things that give us that idea of where they came up with the term of flatten the curve. But where I'm coming up with this idea of righting the curve is from a psychiatrist, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, who back in 1969 published a book called On Death and Dying, where she came up with 5 stages of grief that are common. Back then, her study was on people who were facing death because of a terminal illness. But over the years, her 5 stages have been developed into different models that really apply to any situation where there's a great amount of change or upheaval. And so this is the curve that I want to talk to you about today. And if you Google Kubler-Ross change curve or 5 stages of grief, this is a graphic that you can come up with, and there are some different variations on it, but they all cover basically the same principle, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. And just kind of going back to her original 5 stages of grief, they include things like denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. So we're going to be talking about those sorts of concepts along with a couple of others and modifications. But I think that it's important to talk about this concept of grief in terms of what's happening right now. Think of all the radical changes that have happened for people over the last several weeks. Weddings have been canceled or postponed. High school seniors that were anticipating graduation and prom, these things have been either canceled or postponed, or it's uncertain what's going to be happening with them. People have suffered job loss and financial upheaval. And even things like women who are having babies, birth plans that they had for what their ideal birth experience would be like have really gone out the window. And in some cases, they're not allowed to have the people in the delivery room that they anticipated. So a lot of this is leading to feelings of really grief. And then of course there are people who are going through the ultimate loss where they're actually losing family members that have died because of the coronavirus. But for a lot of people, it's just that we're grieving a sense of a loss of security. We're grieving the loss of our normal routines. So I want you to keep that in mind when you find yourself potentially struggling emotionally, that this really is a grieving process in a lot of ways. And even if we don't take it to the level of thinking about grief, just think about change. Humans in general don't deal with change very well. We're very much creatures of habit. We like predictability. And so certainly over the last few weeks, we've seen that just completely turned upside down. So I'll show you the curve again. And the first step that we see over here is shock. That is one of the initial stages or events that people go through during a period of change. So when shock occurs, this is where there's some sort of surprise or certainly shock about the event that's taken place. And so I encourage you to think about just over the last few weeks, maybe those moments of shock for yourself. What were those moments that kind of stopped you in your tracks and made you think, wow, something big is happening here. Something has happened. Things are not the same. Maybe things will never be the same in some ways. Was it something that you saw on the news? Maybe it was those early reports that were starting to come in about deaths they were seeing in states like Washington or New York. Maybe it was the images of empty store shelves and toilet paper running out. I know that for me, I think my initial moment of shock was when I first heard the president say that they were closing off travel from Europe. That really got my attention. And then just around town here in Billings, Montana, I think another kind of shocking experience was driving to Costco one morning about 15 minutes before they were supposed to open, and seeing a line of people that wrapped around the building. People that were there lining up for toilet paper or hand sanitizer or whatever essentials there were. So those were things that for me personally really got my attention. But in a lot of ways, this has been hard to deal with because the surprises keep coming. And I know for us this week in Montana, seeing our governor, Governor Bullock, declare a shelter in place, I think was another level of shock for people. And then again, for me personally, seeing the news images of my brothers and sisters in medicine out there on the front lines, dealing with what's happening, especially in places with New York, where I have a fondness for New York, having done my education and training there. So that's been very difficult to see. So in a lot of ways, it's been a series of having those shocks happen and maybe moving further through the curve, and we'll talk about the other steps, but then having another shock happen, so I'm back up the curve again and kind of going through that cycle. So, but that's normal in this situation. We're learning every day about what's going on. We've never encountered something like this in our lifetime before, so that's going to be normal to still have some shocks and some changes that happen along the way. The other thing that's been a big surprise is things outside of just talking about coronavirus, like my friends and family in Utah or Idaho that have experienced earthquakes in the last couple of weeks. That's kind of another curveball that gets thrown in there. So the second step on the curve here is, if you go up the curve, this is denial. So again, kind of think about your thoughts and your emotions over the last couple weeks. And I know for a lot of people, when they first heard about what was happening with coronavirus, they were saying, oh, it's just a bad flu, or this isn't any different than the flu. Or I know a lot of people here were saying, well, this is Montana. We're not New York. We're not one of the bigger cities. Maybe thinking that we were going to be somehow sheltered or immune from this. Or maybe it was, people saying, well, it only affects older people, so I don't really have to worry. And in a large part, these are the stories we tell ourselves, maybe because there's a lack of information, but it could also be just our own defense because of the fear that comes along with dealing with the shock of what's happening. And so, again, I noticed for me along the way in the last couple weeks, there have been several points where I thought, wow, this just doesn't even feel real. It feels very surreal. And so I think that's very common that a lot of people are experiencing that in terms of a sense of denial. The next step down on the curve is frustration or anger. Now, I know that this has set in for a lot of people as there's been a loss of job, or they're having to transition to working at home and dealing with some of the frustrations that can come with that. Some of it has to do with taking on some new roles that we're not used to performing in or not feeling very competent in, like parents trying to be homeschool teachers while also trying to manage their work and other things. Some of that anger and frustration comes from things like going to the stores and finding empty shelves. So this is very common to see as people move along that curve. And then here at the very bottom of the curve is depression. And keep in mind, depression can take on a lot of forms. For some people, it may be sadness and being more tearful. For other people, it may be increased irritability. But there can be other things that you don't think of necessarily in terms of just mood. Things like low energy, not sleeping as well, wanting to sleep all the time, losing interest in things that you're usually interested in, not feeling motivated, feeling hopeless, having trouble getting out of bed and functioning. These are all things that can go along with depression. And ultimately, when depression is at its worst and people are feeling very despondent and hopeless, that's where sometimes people can develop suicidal thoughts. And I think that's a really important part of this discussion right now. We need to be talking about this. I know that there's often a stigma behind people seeking treatment or even talking about mental health issues. But in a situation like this, historically, when there have been events that have really had an impact on the economy, even in situations of pandemic, there's often an increase in the suicide rate. And so this is something we've got to be talking about. And to make it worse, what's happening right now is people are suffering, but they're suffering alone and in isolation because of the social distancing that we're trying to do. And a lot of people are feeling very despondent about job loss, financial crises, financial worries, and just the ongoing uncertainty of things. So I want to really emphasize the importance of hope. When people are at the bottom of that curve, it's so important to remember that what is going on is temporary. There is a lot of uncertainty, but this is temporary. And in the meantime, if people find themselves at the bottom of the curve, that's where they really need to be working on some self-care. And Caitlin and I had talked about this a bit in our Facebook Live that we did last week, but these are things like making sure that you're getting adequate sleep. Part of what goes along with adequate sleep is making sure that you're maintaining some routines. So trying to go to bed at the same time every night, wake up at the same time every night. Turn off the news. The news can be really overwhelming, and often they're not saying anything new. So if the news is really heightening your anxiety and your hopelessness, turn it off. Take a break from the news, take a break from social media. And along those lines, really work on clearing out all of the toxic influences in your life. None of that is helpful if you're on the bottom of that curve. It's also really important to be turning to things like drugs or alcohol during this time. That is a big temptation. I think a lot of people who have a history of problems with alcohol or drugs are struggling with the increased stress and the social isolation. So really try to avoid those things. Get active, get outside, exercise. Get up and shower every day. That's part of the daily routine that helps a lot of people feel like they're still kind of connected with the world and a sense of normal routines. And don't forget to nourish your mind and body with healthy foods. It's really tempting to turn to junk foods to self-soothe right now, but that's probably not going to be as helpful as you might think. But ultimately, people need to reach out for help. If they're at the bottom of the curve, they're feeling really hopeless. That could be anything from calling a friend or a family member, and I do mean call, like actually pick up the phone and make a call. Don't just do a text. And there are things like suicide and crisis hotlines for people that are feeling very despondent, for people who are already connected with some mental health services. If you have a therapist, if you have a psychiatrist, please reach out and let them know if you are struggling. But I also want to say to the people who feel like they're doing okay, please reach out to your friends, even your friends that you think are doing okay, and check on them. Really see how people are doing during this time. I know for me, a couple weekends ago, so it's only been about 10 days, I was in a state of feeling pretty low, pretty overwhelmed. That was around the time that I realized, at least in terms of Montana, and our practice here at Montana Psychiatry, that we would need to make some significant changes to our practice in terms of shifting to telehealth. And that's a pretty monumental effort. It felt very overwhelming. I found that weekend I was tired a lot of the time. I had been on Facebook, watching the news kind of obsessively, trying to figure out what my next moves were going to be and how to plan accordingly. And I just found a few times I had to recognize that and just recognize that in the moment I just didn't have the emotional reserves maybe to keep going with the task that I was doing and to take some breaks. And I know by this past weekend I was feeling much more mobilized and ready to move forward. So just be paying attention to how you're feeling. But I encourage you, if you're at the bottom of the curve, take a look at where that curve leads. It leads upward. So this is what I'm talking about with riding the wave. If you're at the bottom, know that it is possible to come back up. And it may not feel like riding the wave, like something that comes easily. It may feel more like having to claw your way out of that point of feeling very down. But this is something that you can do, and something that is temporary in terms of feeling low. So the next stage up the curve is the experimental phase. So this is the part where maybe you start thinking of new ways to problem solve. You start looking at alternatives. Maybe this means trying some new things, learning new things. I think for me, learning from examples in history where people have gone through some very challenging times and have dealt with adversity, and I find that to be very inspirational. So even if I'm not feeling very strong at the moment, reading stories of other people who have made their way out of very challenging circumstances helps me to mobilize my energy and think of how I can move forward. Maybe it's even things like watching some videos on putting together an exercise plan for yourself, or some cooking videos, something that just kind of starts those ideas percolating of how you're going to move forward. For those of you that may be out of work right now, maybe it means thinking of ways that you could retool in your industry. Maybe it's catching up on projects that you had been behind on. And in the experiment phase, it's really where you just kind of start thinking of what you might be doing to move forward. There was an interesting line that I heard from someone recently that said, sometimes you have to start driving the car for the map to appear. And I find that to be so true. Sometimes you have to start moving in a particular direction to have a clearer idea of the direction that you need to go. So that's where the experimental phase becomes very, very important. And then the next phase of that is the decision phase. And this is where you start putting those ideas and plans that you maybe start developing in the experimental phase into action. And once you put things into action, action leads to results, and results can lead to momentum. And momentum then can lead to confidence. But again, if you never start moving forward, you're not going to have the opportunity to build that momentum. But this is where people can start feeling more positive because they regain some sense of control. You start feeling again like, okay, maybe I am the captain of my ship here. Not that we have control over everything that's going on in our lives right now, because that's certainly not the case. But if you look around at the things you can control, it's that decision phase where you mobilize the energy and you put some things into action, and you can really regain a sense of confidence by doing that. And then the final phase of the curve is this step of integration, which is really that step of acceptance that Dr. Kubler-Ross was talking about. So in this stage, people are feeling renewed. They're feeling that confidence. Yes, you're different than you were before. Life is different than you were before, but you're more accepting of it, feeling more comfortable in the new roles that you're taking on, or just feel like you're more resilient and you've bounced back and are used to the new normal. But keep in mind that idea that it's normal for these things to come in waves. You know, you may be moving through that point of experimenting and making decisions, and then some new information comes up, some new unexpected circumstances come up. So you kind of go back to the beginning of the curve. But just know that this is fluid and that the setbacks are temporary and you can move forward. With that, I just want to encourage you again that if you are in a place where you're really needing help, please reach out to someone, whether it's friends or family. If you're a patient within our office, please let us know if you're needing some extra support. We are accepting new patients, and like I mentioned earlier, we have largely shifted the majority of the practice over to being telehealth while we are working through the situation. So if you're looking to establish care, please call our office. We have our contact information on the Facebook page. You can also contact us through the website, which is mtpsychiatry.com. And also, please let us know if there are future topics you would like us to cover with these Facebook Lives. And my hope is to introduce you to some of the other amazing clinicians that we have in our office over the next several weeks by doing more of these Facebook Lives. So with that, I just want to encourage you all to stay safe, be happy, be well, and have a great evening. Thanks so much.